Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On this episode, we're talking about the Jussie Smollett case, and my guest is Dan McConkie of the Northern Illinois University School of Law. He's a criminal law professor there and a former state and federal prosecutor. What I think is so fascinating about this story, well beyond the sensational details of this alleged crime and the apparent hoax and the back and forth with the Chicago prosecutor and the lawyers pointing fingers at each other and these two Nigerian accomplices. And I mean, there's a lot to work with there. But beyond all that is the impact of this case on the criminal justice system and on our faith in the integrity of that criminal justice system. And so we talk with Dan, building on his experience as a prosecutor for a number of years, on such things as whether the prosecutor should exercise discretion here, and why is transparency in this process something so important, and what impact does a hoax like this have on the prosecution of real hate crimes, something that we should be all very concerned about in our criminal justice system. So a really, really important conversation. I hope you'll enjoy it. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we're talking about the Jussie Smollett case, a very complicated, very controversial story with a lot of issues apart from the sensational nature of the story itself. And to help us work through just what are all those issues and understand better what has happened as best we can so far, is my guest today, Dan McConkie, a professor of law at Northern Illinois University Law School in Chicago. Dan, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you, Aaron.
Dan, give us a little bit of background on yourself. I found you and I'm grateful for you joining us on the podcast to work through this. I know, in addition to teaching criminal law and ethics at Northern Illinois University, you also have experience as a prosecutor yourself, and that's going to be particularly helpful, I think, in walking us through and talking about some of the issues that are wrapped up in the way this whole story has played out. But give us a little background on yourself before we jump into the story of this Jussie Smollett.
Sure. Well, I've been fascinated by the criminal justice system since I was a little kid, and graduated from law school in 2004, and immediately went to work at a couple of district attorneys' offices in California. So I was a state level prosecutor there for a couple of years, and then I moved over to the federal system and was a federal prosecutor for several more years. I think it was 9 years in total.
Mm-hmm. Where in California were you? Where in California were you?
Yeah, I prosecuted in Marin County, right, which is just north of San Francisco, but spent most of my time prosecuting in Contra Costa County,
mm-hmm.
Which includes Walnut Creek, it's in the East Bay, Antioch, Pittsburgh.
I grew up in San Francisco, so I grew up in San Francisco, so I know that area very well.
Oh yeah, it's a wonderful place.
It is. And now you teach criminal law and criminal procedure. Is that right?
That's right. I've been a law professor for 6 years now, and that's my focus and my great love is criminal law, procedure, and legal ethics. So the Smollett case, as you might imagine, really caught my attention. And in fact, I'm thinking about ways right now to incorporate it as a case study into a few of my classes, because, as you say, it raises so many interesting and thorny issues.
Absolutely, and to help us get into that, I know probably most people know something about this story. It's been in the national headlines. Jussie Smollett, an actor and singer, and of course just the sensational nature of the way that this has played out. And even today, as we're recording this episode, to be posted just in a couple of days. There are more headlines in this case involving the two brothers who were part of this alleged hoax or alleged crime, depending on which side you come from on this, now bringing a defamation lawsuit against Smollett's lawyer for things that he said about them. So this is going to have a life for a long time to come, for sure. But maybe you could help us, Dan, just to lay out some of the groundwork here for what happened. I know people can go online and find all kinds of chronologies and timelines and all that, but just so we have a basis for our conversation today, give us some of the storyline as this unfolded over a couple weeks.
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it brief. Let me know if you want me to go into any particular details.
Sure.
But, Jussie Smollett, as everybody knows, is at least somewhat famous and is on the TV show Empire and lives here in Chicago. Although I'm out in the country, I should say, just west of the city. But Smollett on January 22nd, he reports that he gets a threat letter, and it's a letter that goes to the studio and says, it says "Make America Great Again," and it has and it says, "You will die black." And then I'm actually not even sure what the racial epithet was used. It was blocked out of all the media accounts that I saw, and some kind of crushed white powder, right? Some kind of white powder that turns out to be, something harmless.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly a threatening letter, and that's Smollett's version. And there's a possibility that I think the FBI is investigating that maybe he himself sent this letter. I don't know. It's hard to know exactly what happened.
Right.
And then a week later is where the incident in question happens, where Smollett he's in the downtown area of Chicago, close to where he lives in the Streetersville area. And at 2 a.m, he's come out of the subway, and as he reports it, two men attack him. They put a noose around his neck. They do some physical injury to him. They say this is MAGA country, and they run off. And Smollett sustained some injuries, reports it as a hate crime. The Chicago PD is all over it. They have at least a dozen, if not 2 dozen, detectives work in this case. A lot of overtime being put in, dozens of search warrants being executed, interest from the feds. This is a big hate crime, and the national media picks up on it. It's obviously if what he alleges were true, it'd be extremely offensive, and every right-thinking American would want justice to be done for his attackers.
Well, hang on a sec. Let me just bring out a couple of other aspects of this, because he alleged that when these supposed attackers are grappling with him and putting this noose around him, that they used racial and homophobic epithets. And of course, Mr. Smollett is African American, and I think is upfront about his sexual orientation. So these become very important details, right? And because this establishes it, if true, not only as an assault, an ordinary assault, but as a hate crime, because of the use of that language in connection with the crime.
That's absolutely right. It would make it a far more serious crime, and the kind of crime that in most of America, the penalties are greatly enhanced for a battery that's accompanied by an intent to harm someone because of their race or sexual orientation or gender. And in this case, it's on race and sexual orientation.
And the other thing that's interesting, and of course, anytime a celebrity is involved in some kind of a crime, it's going to get more attention in the media than from most people, ordinary folks like you and me. But there does seem to have been these details that launch this into even greater newsworthiness, if you will, because not only was this, as he described what happened to him, a hate crime because of the use of this language, but he also references the attackers using language that quite obviously implies a connection, not a direct connection, obviously, but a fondness for President Trump, because they say this is MAGA country, which is which is a reference to Make America Great Again, President Trump's campaign slogan, and we know about these red hats that some Trump supporters wear, and there have been other incidents reported in the news where somebody is either taunting someone else or being taunted by someone else because they're wearing this red hat. So that detail also seems to be something that fuels the sensationalness of this alleged crime.
Absolutely. In fact, President Trump himself made a statement in this story. He said it doesn't get worse as far as I'm concerned, right, than what happened. I mean, and so even he felt the need to distance himself from this. And so there is kind of a political aspect of the story as well. Just it hits on everything, a lot of raw nerves in American society.
Right. Okay. So now the forces of law, the law enforcement investigative machine in Chicago, and even perhaps the federal investigating authorities are getting busy with this case. And what happens next?
Well, I don't have the name of her in front of me, but I know it's the former attorney to Michelle Obama is reaching out to state's attorney Kim Fox, the Cook County elected state's attorney here in Chicago, trying to help, essentially make sure that the victim in this case, that Mr. Smollett, is getting due attention from the police and being properly connected to law enforcement as a crime victim, and Kim Fox is responding to those texts and treating this case as a very serious hate crime, but also as somewhat of a political gift. I mean, it's the kind of hate crime case that everybody can get behind, and it's a popular case for a prosecutor to do, a high-profile case, and so Kim Fox is initially very, very involved in the case, and so originally the police they focus attention on two men who are seen on a few security cameras. Kind of an interesting side note that downtown Chicago is absolutely chock full of security cameras, publicly installed, as well as some other security cameras at private residences, and the police are following that, and they get the lead, and they end up arresting these two brothers. And I should have written down their last name. I wasn't even sure how to pronounce it, but these two men that are accused of eventually attention focuses on them, and they're charged with the hate crime, and law enforcement and the state's attorney are charging hard at this case as a hate crime case. And then over the next couple of weeks, things start to change, and we don't know exactly what's happening behind the scenes, but it appears that the interest of the police is shifting to Smollett, and the police start asking questions about the incident, and some things are just not quite adding up.
Right. Okay. So before we get to how the investigation does completely shift, I found the two brothers are Abel and Ola Osundario.
That's right. Thank you.
And they are, I gather from what I've read, they are from Nigeria and have some connection to Smollett, although it's not clear what that connection is. And then you also mentioned the former chief of staff for First Lady Michelle Obama, and that's Tina Chen, who apparently made some type of outreach to Kim Fox, who would be the prosecuting attorney in this case, at least on state law charges, And that starts to set in motion some concerns about Kimberly Fox, the county attorney, the Cook County State's attorney, being involved, because now, does that, we'll get to this, but does that seem to raise some conflict issues? Although Tina Chen says all she was doing was reaching out to express support for Jussie Smollett and his family, and make sure that they were being treated well. Although we'll talk about what to make of that.
It's hard to stick with one. Yeah.
Right. Okay, but then these brothers get called in as the alleged attackers, and what seems to happen is they tell a story that suggests maybe there's more to this, and maybe this isn't exactly as Smollett reported it, right? So then there is this shift in the investigation, and now the focus seems to turn on himself, on Smollett's conduct.
That's right. I mean, it's a very strange hate crimes case as the police start to think through the implications of all this, right? Because Smollett, to that point, hadn't stated that these two brothers were the attackers. It was assumed that the attackers were anonymous, right? That he didn't know them,
right?
And it turns out he does know them. He had he worked with them, I think, on the set somehow. I think one of them was a personal trainer.
Mm-hmm.
It said, and they may have, they had some kind of professional association, right? And the two brothers are also they're black, and so the racist slurs, again, it's not what we expect.
Right. It's not adding
up. Crime.
Yeah.
No, and I can tell you, if you've been to downtown Chicago, I think you feel pretty safely far away from MAGA country. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit of an unusual. It's not a common hate crime for Chicago.
Right.
It's a very, very blue city, and so and then additionally, of course, these brothers. I mean, they've been caught on film, but they say we did attack Smollett, that he paid us to attack him, and he paid us by check, and they produced the check to the police, and so pretty soon, and then I should also say some smaller details about Smollett. He's just been to the Subway sandwich shop, and after the assault, a half hour later, he's still hanging on to that Subway sandwich bag. I don't know quite what to make of that detail. Maybe sort of as a comfort thing. He doesn't want to lose his sandwich in spite of an assault. You think he might have dropped it if he got attacked like that. It's 2 a.m. in the dead of winter in Chicago. I don't know. Not as many people are out at that time. I don't know which way that cuts. Maybe that's an easier time to attack someone, although there are lots of security cameras everywhere. Anyway, it's a very unusual story that Smollett tells, and the police initially believe it, but by the time they talk with the brothers, they become convinced that just the opposite is true, that this was all fabricated by Smollett.
Well, and it takes the public for a ride too, because again, the details are pretty sensational and horrible as they were first presented. So a lot of people, I mean, we mentioned Michelle Obama's former chief of staff, but a lot of people were kind of rushing to this story and offering great sympathy to him. And then the story turns, and now he starts suggesting that he is somehow a victim, that he's being victimized in this process. So and then he is ultimately indicted by Kimberly Fox's office, although she does not, at least from what she has said and claimed, right? She claims that she recused herself at some point in this process. What's that all about?
Yeah. So before the indictment, right, the police, they've now released the brothers. They're focusing on Smollett and Fox, right? She now feels a need to recuse herself because at the beginning of the case, when it was a hate crimes case, she had what I think were proper communications with Michelle Obama's former attorney, or anyone that would contact the state's attorney on behalf of a hate crime victim and say, hey, are you taking care of this person? Is the victim being properly attended to in this traumatic process of a criminal prosecution? But once Smollett becomes a defendant, those contacts become problematic for Fox because she's now essentially been, in a sense, in a very indirect sense, but a real sense, an advocate for the victim who's now a defendant. And
right.
So that raises, if not a propriety, an appearance of impropriety. And so I think Fox's instincts were good. She says, I think I've got to get off this case, or people might be accusing me of some kind of improper motive, improper bias in favor of someone who's now a criminal defendant.
Right. And that appearance,
but of course,
that appearance of impropriety or appearance of a conflict, in many situations, is just as important as if there were an actual conflict, right? Because even though this has shifted 180 and now the focus is on Smollett, there's still a crime here of some kind, and the prosecutor's office would want nothing to get in the way of the appearance that justice is being done here, however the chips fall and however this plays out. So it does seem like that was an appropriate thing for her to do initially, which was to formally recuse herself or hand off responsibility to a deputy for this particular case.
That's right. I mean, as a former prosecutor myself, I understand very well the ambiguities of criminal prosecutions, and prosecutors, they're well-meaning people. They're trying to do justice. They deal with complicated cases, and above all, they want the citizenry to understand that the process is fair. And as you say, that the chips fall where they may. And I think the public gets that too, even in complicated cases, even where people disagree with the outcome. If they feel like the process was fair, there's at least legitimacy to it, and we can all move on, even if it wasn't handled perfectly. But of course, Fox, she recuses herself from the case, or she says she's recusing herself from the case, and it turns out that she doesn't exactly recuse herself from the case. And her office has subsequently released a trove of documents to the press documenting her, continued communications with other members of her office who are directly handling the case. And she's talking with them about the case. There's a text message where she essentially complains about the case being overcharged. The case did go to grand jury. The office got a 16-count felony criminal indictment. Although the 16 counts, it's a little misleading because it's all for the same incident, and it's all the same charge. I'm still sort of puzzled as to why there are 16 counts, but in any event, her office is taking it very seriously, and she's involved behind the scenes, even though she's claimed to have recused herself from the case.
I mean, let me just understand that process a little bit. So to get a 16-count indictment, or any number of counts in an indictment, the prosecutor's got to take the evidence that's been gathered during the investigative process, and as here, present that to a grand jury and ask for certain counts to be issued by the grand jury. I mean, really, it's the prosecutor calling it, and the grand jury is, we say the grand jury is handing up or handing down these charges. I forget which direction, but really, it's the prosecutor that is asking to have this individual charged with these particular crimes, right?
That's right. I mean, there was a time centuries ago when the grand jury would do its own investigation and decide who to charge, but that's no longer the case. In virtually any grand jury in America, they're a passive body. They sit when the prosecution tells them to sit. They review the proposed indictment from the prosecution. The prosecution puts on some evidence and establishes to probable cause whatever charges the prosecution has selected. So there's no question here that the Cook County State's Attorney's Office felt very strongly about this case. They worked closely with the police and proposed very serious, criminal charges. I say very serious. It's a Class 4 felony, which means that it's more than a misdemeanor, but it's not on the same par as violent crimes. But nonetheless, it's 16 felony charges.
Right, and this was now I believe February 20th when this happened, that these indictments come down. They're for things like filing false police reports, claiming that he'd been attacked, disorderly conduct, and other things. But as you point out, felonies that are serious, not as serious as a violent crime, but nonetheless, if successfully convicted of those, he did face some time in prison, even several years in prison.
That's right.
And then
That's right.
And then all of a sudden, at least as I was following along with the story, it seemed to be all of a sudden. It was on March 7th that the grand jury returned that 16-count indictment. And then a matter of a couple weeks later, it's suddenly announced that the charges were dropped. With very little explanation. I mean, this is a really topsy-turvy course of events here. And then all of a sudden, we think that this guy now is going to be prosecuted for these felonies, for, if we want to just give it a shorthand name, for this hoax. Some people have called it. And now the county attorney's dropping the charges. So what do we understand about that?
Well, I wish we understood more. I think you're right. This happened all of a sudden. I mean, just to put it in context, it wasn't just a grand jury indictment. There was also a press conference and speeches being made by the police and others. And then, as you say, pretty much without warning, the case just goes away. I have it in my notes here that it happened on March 26th, and what happens is that the state's attorney puts it on for a court hearing without giving notice to the press, right? I mean, it is a public court hearing, but they put it on for a public court hearing, and they walk in there and just dismiss the charges. Smollett he's made to I say he's made to. I think this was some kind of agreement.
Yeah.
He forfeits the bond, which was $10,000, so that he could be out of custody during the proceedings. He did some community service. I can't remember if it was a day or two, a little bit of community service. But then the state's attorney just walks into that hearing and dismisses the case without any conditions. And then the record of the case is sealed, and the state's attorney doesn't object to that. So there's clearly some kind of agreement that has been made here, and one of the biggest problems with this case is that the state's attorney had clearly thought that this was a serious crime that Smollett had committed, and then the case just gets outright dismissed all of a sudden. And then you've got the first assistant, Magotz or Magotz, I don't know how to say his name, Joe Magotz, right? He starts talking to the press saying, well, we didn't exonerate him. We just decided that he's not a threat to public safety. We stand behind the investigation. We stand behind the decision to charge him. But we've just disposed of the case in an alternative way. And the state's attorney just kind of says it kind of matter-of-factly like that, and it's just not a satisfying explanation, because the public has been whipsawed back and forth and back again on this case and wants to know why, and they haven't explained why.
So, and then some other things that have happened since then. On March 26th, a couple of days later, it was announced that the city of Chicago was seeking $130,000 from Smollett to cover the cost of the investigation, which to me seems kind of light, actually. I mean, given the attention and everybody that was involved in this for that length of time. But nonetheless, that's what they're claiming they are owed and want to see paid back. And then, as we mentioned at the top of our podcast today, these two brothers are claiming that they are victims of defamation, and they're bringing a lawsuit against the attorney for Smollett. And this part, I think, is interesting too, and maybe this will help us get into some of the issues here too. Kimberly Fox, the prosecutor who drops this, has been blasted since this decision by other prosecutors in the state of Illinois for her handling of this. And so, everybody's still kind of screaming at each other over this. And I think the reason this is such, I think, a great story is because a lot of what we've now covered in laying out the basics of the story as it unfolded over these several weeks, a lot of what happened is not really controversial. It's the kind of stuff that goes on all the time in prosecutions. But there are things that have happened here that are really extraordinary, and I think it's important to try to separate out what are the ordinary and what are the extraordinary aspects of this story, because I suspect you're going to say that some of the things that make this particular story extraordinary, have the potential to do some real damage to good faith efforts in all of these areas. And, so we need to talk a little bit about hate crimes, I think, this whole issue of prosecutorial discretion, which you can speak of from your experience, the importance of transparency in the process of criminal prosecutions and why that's essential to faith in the system and the credibility of the system. And of course, conflicts of interest as they come up and how those get handled. And then finally, I want to save a few minutes at the end to talk about the issue of alternatives to incarceration, because, again, there may be some validity to that in a lot of situations. But the way things played out here maybe puts a bit of a stain on that. So I want to try to understand that as well. So that's kind of an outline of where.
So where would you like to start?
Well, why don't you say a few words, if you will, about hate crimes, because that's what gets this whole case started. And as you pointed out, we are living in a time where there is great sensitivity and well-placed sensitivity to crimes that involve hate, whether they're against African Americans, against people based on sexual orientation, based on religion. We just had an attack on worshipers in Sri Lanka observing Easter Sunday services. There was an attack on Christians. There was an attack on synagogue goers in Pittsburgh last year. We live in a time of great stress when it comes to these types of crimes. They're very serious, and so naturally people got very concerned and very disturbed by what Smollett was alleging happened to him. So, talk about that a little bit and why how this case, the way it's played out, may impact the way we as a country and the way prosecutors approach these types of cases.
Yeah. Well,
that's a lot.
In the first place, yeah, it is. And it is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, because hate crimes are a very serious problem. Right? I have a Bureau of Justice statistics report that says between 2004 and 2015, according to victim surveys, there were 250,000 hate crimes. Right, 250,000 per year.
In this country, in the U.S.
That's in the United States. That's right. And so, it's hard to sometimes it's hard to explain to people that say a crime, a battery, an attack should be punished the same for everyone, regardless of the reasons for the crime. And I understand that point of view, but the fact is, a hate crime, it puts people in fear, right? It's when if what Jussie Smollett said was true, that he was attacked because he's black and because he's gay, that targets a segment of American society, a segment that has a history of suffering violence because of those same reasons. And so there's an additional social harm, and it's critically important that prosecutors prosecute hate crime. And they can't prosecute hate crime unless the public believes in the justness of the cause. And this case has caused many people, perhaps especially those who are already doubtful or cynical about hate crimes in the first place. But nonetheless, also, I think people who are maybe more on the fence, it has caused people to doubt whether we ought to be focusing so much attention on hate crimes. It has fed a narrative that hate crimes are hoaxes. And that is absolutely untrue. There are some hoaxes. For all kinds of crimes, there are occasional false reports. But as with sexual assault and domestic violence and child abuse, while there are occasional false reports, the vast majority of the time, the victims are telling the truth. And so, that's the core harm that's been done here.
Yeah, that's where my thoughts were going as I was listening to you. Is the comparison to sexual assault crimes, where you can get a very well publicized false accusation, and that does great damage to the credibility of the vast majority of cases that are credible and that are valid and that need to be taken seriously, and those victims need to be believed. And that this seems to be, and you can't just say, well, maybe it wasn't true in my case, but the point is still a valid point. No, that doesn't seem like a valid argument either. This is something that not only, if true, and by the way, we should say, as I understand it, he is maintaining his innocence even to this day, and that may get at something about the issue of transparency when we come to that issue. But he's perhaps because of the way this has played out and it was wrapped up and dismissed and kind of shrouded in secrecy, he is able to continue to maintain his innocence here. But assuming that it is what it appears to be, that this was fabricated, I mean, that not only damages his own reputation, it seems, but it does seem to pose a threat to the credibility of other valid, credible, important hate crimes that need to get the attention that they deserve to get.
I agree, and you also raise an important point, Aaron, that because the district attorney just dismissed the case and we've never gotten an adjudication as to guilt or innocence, there is less certainty here than there should have been. Right? We have a system that is pretty good at getting to the bottom of things when it runs its course, and we've all been deprived of that opportunity. And so all I can say is, based on the news reports I've read, I have personally concluded that Smollett has fabricated this, but I can't be sure, right? Because I've only gotten incomplete accounts. There hasn't been a trial. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. I can't convict him based on what I know, and not that I've been asked, but it's just we're all left guessing, and the criminal process is supposed to give society some kind of certainty, so we can decide what happened and moved on, and if it's a hoax, then someone who perpetrated it ought to be punished, and we've all been deprived of that now.
No, that's fascinating to me too, because I practice as a lawyer on the civil side, and it's common that when cases settle, when a civil case settles, it is very common, if not the rule. There may be exceptions, but those are few. It's generally the case that when there is a settlement and an exchange of a settlement amount in dollars, that the party paying the settlement doesn't admit responsibility. And in fact, that language appears in almost every settlement agreement I've ever been part of. But it doesn't seem like that's really the practice and the convention on the criminal side. That there certainly are many, many times that a criminal defendant will reach a plea deal, which is a kind of settlement in the criminal side. But we all know what the terms of that deal are. You don't have situations where someone charged with a crime makes a deal or a settlement, and we don't know really what to make of that settlement one way or the other, right? How unusual is that? It seems to me it's very unusual, but you can tell us.
Right. Well, yeah, the answer is, for the vast majority of criminal cases, when a conviction is obtained, it's obtained by a guilty plea. And that guilty plea puts to rest, for the most part, doubts about whether the defendant did it or not, because the defendant typically admits. there is a procedure whereby a defendant can simply accept the punishment without actually saying I did it. That's called an Alford plea based on an old Supreme Court case. But those are disfavored, and fortunately not very common, although I still think they're too common. I think, getting back to the main point, though, I think it's very important that that the criminal law reinforce societal norms, moral norms that we all agree on. Like, it's wrong to attack someone based on their sexual orientation or their race or whatever. Norms like it's wrong to lie to the police and effectively impede their investigation into other crimes because you're drawing their resources away to something that's a hoax. Right? These are moral norms that we all share, and the criminal law is supposed to vindicate them. And so, while in civil law, when it's a matter between two private parties, we're not, if those two parties are satisfied with the settlement, fine. But in the criminal law, where the public has an interest, we want an adjudication. We want to know, did the defendant do it or not? Because the stakes are so high. If somebody's convicted of a crime, they suffer serious repercussions that last for years. And so there's no justification for that if the person's not actually guilty. And so, at least as an ideal, we'd like to know, even in the Smollett case, even if they had used some kind of alternative disposition and said, hey, this Smollett guy, he's never had a prior criminal history. Let's go easy on him. He seems like he's never going to do this again. That may well have been appropriate, actually. But it would have been far better if they had forced him to admit what he did. Right? That's the first step in our forgiving him as a society, and then letting him move on. But if he never admits to what he did, if he instead, as is the case here, walks out onto the courthouse step 5 minutes later and loudly proclaims his innocence, and is basically demanding an apology from the city of Chicago, then, what did we get out of this? It's just not a good way to run the system.
Well, and the public nature of this case, which, by the way, Smollett started. He went public with this, so he made it a public event. He made it a news story in the way that it was reported. Then everybody else, got on board with that, from the prosecutors holding press conferences to the defense team holding press conferences to, every other part of this that's become such a public story. But most of the time, in the life of a prosecutor's office, right, there are all kinds of situations where a prosecutor exercises discretion. There may be all kinds of suggestions of a crime committed that the prosecutor says, we're not going to prosecute that. Either it's too small, or we have other priorities in this office that, where we have to devote our resources, or for a whole bunch of reasons. Prosecutors cannot prosecute every crime committed. And we don't hear about those. Ordinarily, we don't even necessarily, as a public, know that a crime has been committed, let alone that a prosecutor's office has exercised discretion not to pursue that crime. But that's very different from what we have here. So it seems like the issue of prosecutorial discretion, that's a normal part of a prosecutor's experience. But here, because of the public nature of it, it does seem very, very different.
That's right. I handled probably thousands of cases as a prosecutor, and in the vast majority of instances, I exercise my discretion. I consult with supervisors. We do what we thought was the right thing, and nobody besides the attorney on the other side, or the judge, or occasionally a victim or witness or a cop involved with the case, would ask us why we did what we did. And it's very uncommon that prosecutors have to publicly justify what they do, and maybe that's okay for the vast majority of cases. The public doesn't seem to be very interested in all the cases. But in a case where the public is very interested, a case that garners national and even international attention, it's well established and agreed upon by prosecutors, national associations, that state the reasons for what they're doing. Because if they don't, the public concludes that the system is not fair or transparent.
Mm-hmm.
And so here the state's attorney should definitely have given reasons for what they did. It can be a little uncomfortable to have to explain it sometimes, right? Sometimes the reasons have to do with police botching an investigation, or whatever it is, but an explanation has got to be given in a case like this. And you're right, prosecutors are not accustomed to having to publicly state the reasons for why they exercise their discretion the way they do.
And I guess that ties into one of the other issues we flagged in this case, which is the issue of transparency. I mean, the county attorney, Kimberly Fox, essentially going quietly to court in a case that otherwise, was anything but quiet, and dismissing the charges and then having the record sealed. How unusual is that, in particularly in a high-profile type case?
Well, I can tell you it's not unusual at all in a low-profile case, right? The state's attorney says we have thousands of cases every year that get an alternative disposition, and the definition of that term is kind of squishy, right? Some reporters have said, well, the state's attorney has claimed that it's 5,000 or maybe 6,000, whatever it was, and local reporters saying maybe it's a few thousand. And sometimes alternative disposition means a program, other times an outright dismissal or something creative. It happens all the time, but not in cases where there is great public attention. I mean, there's no good reason why the state's attorney would have disposed of this case in this way. They did not have that option. They needed to explain why they did what they did, even though in a lot of other cases where there wasn't public attention, when nobody cared, they do it this way because they have a lot of cases to handle, and it's just not, they're just not matters of great public interest, so nobody cares.
Well, and Dan, I'm wondering too, beyond just the fact of there being a high public interest, a high news media interest in this case, when a prosecutor is making a decision over how to dispose of a case like this, here was to drop the charges, to reach some type of agreement on alternatives to prosecution. You mentioned community service, paying of forfeiting of the bail money and that kind of thing. In other types of situations, as you mentioned, it might be entering into some type of program for a period of time or some other type of restitution, perhaps. How much is the prosecutor thinking beyond just the issues involved in that particular person's case, to what message that may send, to what impact that has in terms of deterrent, in terms of public confidence, however it might be thought of? How often in a prosecutor's mind are those kinds of issues at stake in the handling of how a case is disposed of like this?
That's a very good question, Aaron. I think prosecutors are generally aware that what they do has in a given case has repercussions in future cases, and so they try to handle things consistently. But at the end of the day, they deal with cases, one case at a time, and in an environment where they're not scrutinized closely over run-of-the-mill cases, like a Class 4 felony in Cook County. Right? Those are a dime a dozen. I think they're more concerned about what does the judge think about this disposition, because I'm going to appear before this judge next week or tomorrow on a similar case, and if I give a really good deal to this person, I have to do it for the next person. I think they're worried about what the defense attorney is saying, particularly if it's a public defender, because public defenders talk to each other, right? So I don't think line prosecutors, the unelected prosecutors are thinking quite as much about the public opinion. It's the elected prosecutors and the first assistants at the top of the food chain that are thinking a little more about the politics.
Well, and I guess I wasn't even so much thinking about politics, and I understand what you mean. I mean, I care about that. Every lawyer has to care about how they appear in front of a judge, if they care about the next time they appear in front of that same judge. That kind of thinking beyond the immediacy of the case in front of you, I think is common, throughout our legal system. But I was thinking back to something you'd said earlier about although we can say these are class 4 felonies, and there are certainly more serious, more violent crimes that take place all the time that need the attention of law enforcement and prosecutors. Nonetheless, there is an interest in having people not falsely report to the police and trigger big investigations and take resources away from other real crimes that are being committed. And so, yeah, you want to handle the case in front of you. And again, I'm leaving aside the celebrity nature of this, the high public interest in this case, but there are issues that go beyond just the actual words of the criminal law that's been violated here, and the prison term or the other punishment that might be on the table. There is an interest, isn't there, in not only how justice is done with this particular person and what happened here, but because of the statement that makes in the prosecutors bringing justice in that case.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think prosecutors in individual cases do. I think they try to consider that. They try to look down the road and think about, what's the social interest of this case and what greater good is served by what we're doing. I guess I would say what's different about this case, obviously, is it's not necessarily well, I guess it's a couple of things, right? One is the fact that this is a very public case, and because it's public, it is affecting the way people view the justice system, right? And most cases don't do that because they're not high-profile cases. And so, yeah, I agree. I mean, the prosecutor should have been thinking, how is my disposition of this case going to view the way people going to change the way people view the justice system? And they should have thought that way, and I don't think they thought through that carefully at all here. I think they just wanted the case to kind of quietly go away, presumably for reasons having to do with weaknesses of the evidence or the political implications of a case that's just kind of hot, almost too hot to handle, and they miss the bigger picture, which is we've got a hoax here, and the public's mad about it. And if you just dismiss it and try to sweep it under the rug, people think that the justice system isn't considering any of those important interests. Somehow that got forgotten here.
Yeah, well, and that kind of leads me to my final question, and please yell at me if you think this is an unfair question, but it is, when I think back and look back over all that's happened and everything that we've talked about over the last hour, it strikes me that what started as a really horrible hate crime, the way it was initially presented, now we look back at all the key people involved, and it just seems like everybody is claiming that they are a victim. I mean, Smollett is claiming that he's a victim now, an unfair system, and he's maintaining his innocence. And these two brothers who got paid to participate in this hoax are now claiming that they are victims. And even the county attorney, Kim Fox, who did all the things that she did, is claiming that the people now, including her fellow prosecutors throughout the state of Illinois who are criticizing her, she's now claiming that she's a victim and that these criticisms wouldn't exist if she wasn't herself African American, and it's got nothing to do with what happened, actually, or what she did or didn't do.
Her kids are the victims too.
What's that?
She said that she's claimed that her kids are the victims now, because of the intense scrutiny that she's under, and even on a personal level that she's under, and threats she's received. And
yet they all went out and had their press conferences when it served their interests and made it a public story when they wanted it to be. And now that it is kind of blown up in their faces, everybody's a victim here. And so I guess my question is, who do you think is the real victim, or what do you think is the real victim here?
I think I'm the real victim here. I'd like to know what actually happened.
Right. I think there is something to that.
Right.
We may be all the victims in this story.
I think that's right. I think, again, referring to our public servants, they're supposed to act in the public interest. And I know hindsight's 20/20, but this one is so obvious. I mean, when you handle a high-profile case, you've got to explain why you're doing what you're doing. That is just so elementary. And so in a sense, we're all victims here. And then I guess the other thing I would say is that, again, the problem with an outright dismissal is that we're not going to get clear answers. And without clear answers, this ambiguity kind of feeds on the cycle of victimhood, right? Because everybody can jump in and say they're a victim here because there's no agreed upon set of facts. We rely on the system to sort things out and tell us what happened. And because we can't do that in this case, there's plenty of room for a lot of competing narratives, mutually exclusive narratives. It cannot be the case that those brothers and Smollett and Kim Fox are all victims here. Somebody screwed up and ought to be held to account for it, but the system has, at least to this point, failed us on that count.
Well, right. And it may not be done. I mean, these brothers, I think the initial take on these brothers' defamation lawsuit is it probably doesn't have a lot of legs to it. But we'll see. It might. And if it does, if it can get past some early motions to dismiss and they get access to discovery, some of these things may come out through that action, or there may be some civil case that we haven't been presented with yet that may lead to the facts actually coming out. But does seem in some
that's a hopeful note.
Yeah, that is. Well, I want to end on a hopeful note because I think it's not prurient interest. I think that we want to know. It's that it does seem like the integrity of the process, which we should all value and we should all want to preserve and to defend, depends on the truth coming out here. And if Kimberly Fox behaved inappropriately, then that so be it. If Smollett perpetrated a hoax, then there should be consequences to that. But the truth has to come out here, it seems, for the good of the system.
That's right. That's right. And we've got civil cases. We've got an independent investigation now going on into the Cook County office. I think the FBI is still looking into this. So we may yet get our explanation.
Well, we hope so. Dan McConkie, thank you so much for this great conversation about a really confusing but important case. And again, it goes way beyond just the sensational details. I mean, the impact on the criminal justice system is important, and I really appreciate and value your perspective and helping us understand this all better. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I've enjoyed it too.